The Bible is an old book. It tells stories of kings, paupers, warriors, and priests. And with a lot of things like these and thous, sometimes we ask, who's writing this stuff? I'm Pastor Paul Conway. I'm here with Pastor Luke Rangel. We're here to talk all things Bible. Luke, how are you?
I am doing great, Paul. Thank you for asking. And I am really excited to dive in today. Last week, we talked about kind of like the what of the Bible. And you touched on how it's a co-authorship of humans and God. And today we're going to talk about the who.
Yeah, last week we focused on the what, and we went long. And so
you went long.
I went long. So we're going to try and be a little shorter today, but it was by design. We can't talk about the broader concepts and the deeper concepts of the Bible if we don't know what it's saying.
Right.
Now that we've done the work to go, okay, this is the story of the Bible, now we can really dive into these questions. And this week, yeah, like you said, we're looking at who, specifically who's writing the Bible, who's making it happen. It's an important topic, I think.
No, absolutely. So I think we could kind of start off is how do they even decide like who the who is?
Like how do we know who's doing it and
Right.
how do we get there?
Yes.
Before we get to that, I'd like to address something. We are doing this series because we have heard from our students, I want to go deeper into the Bible. We hear that phrase all the time. I want to go deeper. I want to know my Bible more. I want to know how to read the Bible more. And we hear this term like, I want to go deeper. And I think what we think that means is we think it means we're going to acquire more knowledge. We have all these questions and we're going to acquire the answers to them. And there's a topic that we're wrestling with and we're just going to know how to answer it. But I would argue that that's not going deeper. That's going wider. We try to go wide and gather knowledge and information about the Bible. But I'm bringing this up because even the question you asked, like, how do we know who wrote the Bible? Spoiler alert, a lot of these answers are going to be vague and unknown. That's just how things are going to go. And so I would say going deeper with the Bible means wrestling with the uncertainty that comes with this book. We want it to be certain about everything. And there's some things that it is certain about, but other things, the more you go deeper, the more you wrestle with going, I don't even know. I don't even know what I don't know anymore. And so I wanted to bring that up now. I thought of it last night. Don't confuse going wider with going deeper, for sure.
Right. And I think that's a good point as well that for us and then also students, of course, to know that it's okay to not know everything 100%. I think there's a lot of beauty in that as well, just knowing that part of our relationship with Christ and the Bible does rely on some faith as well.
Yeah, it's very, very true. If all the answers were readily apparent, it wouldn't be faith. It would just be a science. And this relationship and this faith is much more than a transactional piece of knowledge. That being said, there are some really good knowledge bits that we get to talk about. What did you had asked something?
I asked about just how do they even decide who the who is?
Yeah, well, that's the thing is there are some answers that are pretty easy, you know. Like we said last week, the Bible is a collection of various works, spanning from like 1200 BCE all the way to like 70. So like almost 2000 years. So the answers are going to vary. Some answers are easy. You know, you see letters that Paul wrote, and it says pretty clearly, hey, my name is Paul, and I'm writing these letters. But others are trickier to find, and this is where the work of scholarship comes in, and sometimes we have to trust that the people who have done the work have done it accurately. But there are ways that people have done the work. So, for example, I have a very distinct style of texting. And if you saw a screenshot of a text that I sent, if you know me well, you would know that I sent it. One is I don't have capitalizations on my phone. Have you noticed that?
I have not noticed that. I need to text you more.
All the people in the room all have my number. There's like 100 people in this room, by the way. Camera doesn't focus on them. But if you saw a text that I had sent, you would know that's Paul because all of his texts are lowercase. And that's like a silly example, right? But that's kind of the work that scholarship does sometimes is we look at texts and we go, okay, these words were not super popular until this time. And so we go, okay, that helps us date these texts. And some are going to be easier than others, but some are just going to be approximations. we think that it's these people because it would make the most sense.
Right. So you mentioned the letters of Paul, kind of easier. He mentions his name many times. It's kind of the same style of writing throughout. What are some cases in your mind that might not be so easy to understand? Or
Yeah, well, there are answers that are easy and I would say helpful and correct. I don't even like saying correct because that feels gross, but like the letters of Paul, that's an easy one. Others, okay, let's just jump into it. Like the first 5 books of the Bible, we call it the Pentateuch. We talked about it last week.
right.
People would like to say that it was written by. Actually, let's take a step back. Sorry, you can cut this if you not, or you leave it in. It's candid. When you think of somebody who wrote the Bible, or even a part of the Bible, what image comes to your mind?
As far as like them writing it,
Yeah. Where did like when you visualize it in your mind, where does it go?
in my mind, it's kind of like some old guy, or who's young, old to us, either chiseling it on some kind of tablet or have some kind of weird paper with some weird utensil. I don't know how they wrote.
Yeah,
back then.
in my mind, there's a candle. Like it's one guy and he's got a beard and he's at a desk and it's dark and he's got a candle and he's writing these things.
Yeah, like
And-
Scrooge,
like Ebenezer
yeah.
Scrooge. And that's what we think. And maybe that's the same for you guys as well, but that's really not how it went down. Partly because we today put so much emphasis on writing stuff down. There was a very common theme, I don't even want to say back then, but during the time of especially the ancient Near East, that writing things down was actually less important than speaking them. There was this belief that once you wrote something down, it became, those words became dead, that they became stuck, and you couldn't adapt and you couldn't grow with it. And so I bring that up to say that if some God event happened where, when God parts the Red Sea, none of those people's minds would go, I've got to write this down. That's not the way that they operate. And so we think of this idea that the Bible is written by people who are cataloging every detail as or even soon after. But that is rarely the case. And so especially the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. There's lots of stuff happening. Hey, if you're running from Egypt and you're escaping slavery, you're not gonna be pulling out your notes app and writing it down. It's just not the case.
Right. Or I think the big example I could think of in the book of Genesis is Moses dying. I don't think he could write about his own death.
Yeah, in Exodus, after Moses gets out, everyone says that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, but he dies in it. So yeah, you're right. He's not going to be able to write, and then I died, unless he's really good at predicting the future, and that would be morbid to write about. But that's an easy answer. And so if you want an easy answer, we could say Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. But I don't think that's a healthy answer or a helpful answer. Most likely, the first 5 books of the Bible were written by a collection of people at various points in time. We talked about last week the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. It's not until Israel and Judah become established as full kingdoms that we start to see a lot of these texts actually appear. Our oldest manuscripts go back to around that time, and the language used would have been used around that time. And so most likely when you're a kingdom that's been established and you have scholars that can actually write, then you start to go, oh, we should start writing our stories down. Because that's what the first 5 books of the Bible are, is stories and laws that have been passed down from generation to generation. Once you're established, now you can be like, okay, let's write these things down. So that's important to know, right? It's not just one guy.
Right. So with these writings, I think one main question that I have and a lot of people have is like when they were sitting there with their candle, writing on something with their beard, did they have like this idea of the Bible in mind when they were writing it? I guess kind of a 2-part question. Did they think of that? But then also, did they know maybe some kind of prophecy on who we would be in the future? Or do they just have like their ancient mindset when they're writing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like, again, it's a complicated, every answer is going to have a complicated 5-part thing to it. But I'm going to try and keep it short. In some ways, yes, most of the authors of these texts knew that they were writing things that were significant. I would say, especially the older texts, especially the Old Testament, they knew that what they were writing was meant to go out to a lot of people, especially when things are written by scholars and kings. They knew this is going to be a big deal. But I would say that they probably didn't have us in mind when they were writing it. At the very least, we were not their primary concern. Doesn't mean that what they wrote is irrelevant to us, no. But it does mean we need to be careful about translating their stories to our stories as well. I would say there are other authors that, you look at the letters, they probably just thought that it was going to be significant letters, for sure. I don't think anybody wrote a letter in the Bible that was like, this is worthless,
Right.
But I would say that there was some level of significance, but most of them probably didn't have us in mind. And that changes the way we read it. That changes the way we read the Bible. Rather than ask, okay, what does God have in mind for me? Start to ask, okay, what did the author of this text mean for their audience? And how can God use this text for me as well? Because that's where co-authorship comes in. It's both humans writing to humans writing to God, and God writing to humans all in the same time. We think that we say we want to know more about the Bible, but if we don't know why these people wrote these things, it's gonna not go as far as we want it to go. And knowing who these people are changes the way we see these stories. Can I give you an example?
Please.
We all know, well, I don't want to say that. Many people have heard the story of Jonah and the whale, right? You know the story of Jonah and the
I
whale?
do. Some got thrown overboard. God sent a big fish, swallowed him up, and spit him out 3 days later.
Yes, and that is not the part we're going to focus on at all.
All right.
The story of Jonah is one where Jonah is asked to speak to a city called Nineveh, which is the capital of a country called Assyria. And that's a significant moment because, as we talked about last week, Assyria is the country that destroyed Israel entirely. And so that would be a big deal. And in the story of Jonah, it's Jonah himself, the character, does not like Nineveh, but the author of this story seemed to think favorably of Nineveh and Assyria, because we see at the end of the story, Nineveh turns from their ways and God spares them.
Right.
And that's a story that we see that has a really good, that is really good and shows a character of God that we see is forgiving. But we see the same idea in the book of Nahum. You heard the book of Nahum?
I've heard of the book.
It's one of the minor prophets.
Yeah.
The book of Nahum is much meaner in their approach to Nineveh, if that makes sense.
It does.
Nineveh, the author of Nahum speaks on Nineveh and is delighting and I'm saying a lot because I'm trying to be careful about how I say these things. But the author of Nahum seems to delight in the destruction of Nineveh much more. Mm-hmm. No city lasts forever, and Assyria did fall, just like most of these nations did. The author of Nahum seems to be much more happy that it had fallen. And so we've got two writers, we've got two stories that have two different feelings towards the same thing. The author of Jonah seems to be much more forgiving than the author of Nahum does, and that's because who's writing it? The author of Nahum was most likely a scholar who fled from the destruction of Israel soon after Assyria destroyed it. The author of Jonah was probably much more of a Judahite scholar who probably is surviving the destruction of Jerusalem. And so we see the way these people's context situates their feelings towards these events. Somebody who was destroyed by Assyria would have a lot harder time forgiving Assyria than somebody who is like, hey, we have fallen and made mistakes just like Assyria has. Perhaps we can be more forgiving.
Right. And this may touch on a future episode of When, but did Nahum and the writer of Jonah, were they written at like different times?
Yes.
As well?
Yes. A little bit of a spoiler, different times as well.
Okay.
There's probably a couple, like 100, if not a few hundred years between the two that would give a little bit more of space for those events.
Right.
And I want to address something as well, because maybe some of you are hearing this and thinking this. The writer of Nahum seems to write a little differently than the writer of Jonah. Does that mean that both are wrong? No, not at all. But it does mean that this book is co-authored, and one of those authors is humans. And it allows us to process the Bible as a multi-perspective, as a way to say things. There's not one way to look at things, and God is not bound by one perspective. And was there a time where God's heart was broken at the destruction of Israel? Absolutely. But does that mean that God also can't forgive the destroyers? Absolutely. And when we read the Bible, we get to see one perspective at a time of the multiple perspectives that God has.
Right, right. And I don't know if this is the direction we want to go next, but it seems like a good segue into having different writers write about the same city. In the New Testament, we have 4 different writers talking about Jesus, the 4 Gospels.
Yeah.
Which do have some contradictions. Some have stories, some left out stories. Is there reasons behind that? Should we be worried about that?
Yeah, even contradictions sounds harsh. But you're right. You open up the Bible, you open up the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all right there. And it's like, yeah, why do we need to tell the same story 4 different times? Well, again, if we think of it as just like one guy is like, I'm going to write the Bible, then there's no reason to write it. But they are different perspectives, all from different communities and groups of people as well, trying to spread the story of Jesus. And so you have 4 different perspectives, 4 different people, and I would even say probably more like groups of people. When it says the gospel according to Matthew, it's probably a school of people, and Matthew was one of them, or people studied under Matthew, all trying to get these things. Because again, they're trying to spread the message of Jesus. That's an incredibly important and powerful task. They're not going to leave it up to just a guy with a stone tablet. They're going to be careful about the things that they say. And so, yes, these are people writing down stories that they have heard, or writing down stories that they experienced when they saw Jesus. And, if there's 100 people in this room, if I asked all of them to describe the way that like the morning went, they would all tell a similar story, but they might not have the same details aligned. And I think that lends more credibility to the Bible than takes away from it. We can look at the Bible and say, well, this story says that Jesus did this, and this story says that Jesus did that, and they can't both be true. But I think it means that maybe those details aren't as important as the fact that Jesus was someone who was on the move. And Jesus was someone who did do these things, and the similarities are much more powerful than there are differences. But that also means we have to be able to look at these texts and recognize them as different stories from different people, all trying to tell the same story, and that's okay.
Right. And then I think with another question that comes to mind is like, we have these 4 writers or committees around these 4 writers. There was also other writers who wrote things about Jesus that didn't make the Bible.
Ooh.
Do they matter so much? Or
we're getting into hot water here. Yeah. With the Protestant Bible that we have has 66 books of the Bible. Does that mean that there were 66 different collections and 66 different books that were written? No. There are lots of texts that were written that did not make the cut. I am careful even saying that. Yes, there are lots of writings about Jesus. So one of them is there's like a sayings collection of the different sayings that Jesus has that's not in the Bible. And there are lots of reasons why things don't make it in the Bible. Lots of them have to do with just the validity of the sources. Again, when things are being spread, some people are going to try and write things that aren't true and try and get it into the Bible. And we have our scholars and church fathers who have looked and say, this doesn't line up. And but that doesn't mean that they aren't important and weren't considered important by the people at the time. But yes, there are other texts that show up that aren't in the Bible. And maybe it's not true, or maybe it's helpful but not divinely inspired. But there's plenty of writings that exist. Yeah. We're having really good conversations. But the hope and the goal for these videos is that this is the start of conversations that will continue students in their small groups.
Right.
So we're going to have to try and wrap up. I feel like we talked more about the concept of who rather than just saying who wrote all these things. But that's exactly the point. We got you. If you are looking at the Bible and just trying to get a direct answer of who wrote these things, Sometimes you'll get some easy answers. Paul wrote some letters. Some people wrote some things, but most of them is going to be, we don't really know. We have some ideas. Old Testament stuff, probably a lot of scholars during the reign of Israel and the reign of Judah, and then post-exilic Judah after it's recovering. There's some short answers for you.
Yeah, and I actually really like that idea, because the more I dive into it, one kind of phrase that I keep hearing when we read the Bible is it's more like meditation literature. It's something you're supposed to read, think about, meditate on it, read it again, and just kind of come up with concepts that make sense to you in your life and what you believe God is actually speaking to you.
Yeah, and the next few weeks, now that we know the who in mind, even if we still don't know who wrote these things, we know that that's an important idea. Next week, we're going to look at the actual timeline of when these things were written. And then after that, I think the most important thing is, why were these texts written? But we can't really answer those questions until we start settling on the who of the Bible. And every time I keep saying that, I keep thinking of the song, Who Are You?
Oh, no, I was thinking of Whoville.
Well, this is probably the time where we're going to get too silly and we should probably start wrapping up. But guys, I hope that this helps some conversations. I hope that this unlocks maybe some more questions that you didn't know you were allowed to ask. Maybe this answers some questions that you just had. My hope is that the next hour of small groups is full of just conversations about asking questions, asking more questions, maybe trying to answer some questions, and hopefully it will look a little bit like this dialogue as well. So guys, we'll see you next week.